First is there's a sense, if you read the media, that cloud is everywhere, and so the question is it really everywhere? And our data shows that it's at least in quite a lot of places. We did a survey recently with a California-based research firm called TechConnex, in which we looked at 635 Canadian respondents, split pretty evenly between business decision makers and IT decision makers, and 820 comparable US respondents, again split pretty evenly between BDMs and ITDMs. One of the questions we asked is, are you using cloud? Are you planning to use cloud in the next 12 months? Which, since the survey was done in December, meant sometime in 2014. And what we found was just over 40% of Canadian SMBs said that they were currently using cloud, and about half that number, again, planning to take their first step into cloud sometime in 2014. Use of cloud is much more widespread in medium and large firms. You'll notice throughout where we use this phrase, there's an asterisk next to large. The survey itself went all the way from single employee companies to companies with 999 employees, but didn't go into the enterprise accounts larger than that. So medium and large is everybody from 200 employees to 999 employees, consistently through the course of the 99 slides that we prepared for the day, some of which you'll be relieved to know we've already gone through. But I mean, cloud is very widespread, over 75% in medium business in Canada today, with another 15%, which will bring us over 90%, planning to adopt within the next 12 months or sometime in 2014. We're often asked, how does that compare to the US? And the truth is the comparative numbers are very similar for the US. There wouldn't be statistically significant differences in the two groups. For what it's worth, though, I mean, you've all heard the phrase lies, damn lies, and statistics, and there's another flavor of that somewhere in here. Merely using cloud isn't really the touch point that we're going to use in the future. I mean, when I started doing cloud presentations several years ago, that was a big question. Are people in the cloud or not in the cloud? And then they started to say, okay, we can be in the cloud, but how do we use cloud better? And now what we're finding is, how do we use cloud more is the key question. How do we not just adopt a single cloud application or platform, but how do we use multiple cloud applications? And tried to put together a picture of how cloud is progressing in the Canadian market. If you look at it not as an in or out issue, but as a proportion of spending on infrastructure. And this is a slide that I put together. We've talked to this at a couple of our peer groups, looking at from 2012 to 2020, what is the actual spending on physical infrastructure, data center infrastructure, so servers, networking, and storage, and infrastructure as a service. And how is that expected to change over time? And in here I did build in a lag for Canadian results versus US results based on the Gartner information. But I came to a model that looked kind of like this. And the assumption is that in 2012, infrastructure as a service is a very small fraction of every dollar being spent on infrastructure overall. So 3 cents in spending on IaaS for every dollar being spent on physical hardware for servers, storage, and networking. As we move across, what we see is a very high growth rate initially for infrastructure as a service, because you're building off a very small base. And then the growth rate kind of leveling out in the low 30% out through the rest of the decade. Physical infrastructure moves a little bit differently, where we start with a negative growth rate of 5 or 6%, which drops off really dramatically in this model in about 2018 and starts to really plummet out in 2020. You can argue which years these inflection points are going to happen in, but I think that the overall story, I haven't seen anybody push back too hard on that. The overall story being that cloud is currently small relative to spending on physical infrastructure, but growing quite rapidly. And then if you move out to the end of the decade, it represents a relatively large part of every dollar being spent on infrastructure. That's really important because the underlying presumption between the are you in or are you out kind of approach to cloud is that it's a switch. You either have physical or you have on-prem. And what this slide shows quite clearly is virtually everybody is going to go through a transition. We use the word hybrid to describe use of public and private cloud in an integrated area. That's a stupid definition of hybrid. The real definition of hybrid is applying cloud and physical infrastructure in a reasonably seamless fashion. And what this slide shows is that virtually everybody in Canada is going to have to do that over time and increasingly out through the end of the decade. If you look at the results of surveys of IT decision makers, that's the key driver. Why are you buying cloud? We're buying cloud to reduce costs. Why wouldn't you buy cloud? We're afraid of security. Like, you see that in the press all the time, and when we do surveys of IT decision makers, we get those answers back ourselves. What you don't see, though, is what the business decision maker says. Because what they say is the reason why we would go to cloud is not to reduce costs, it's to get net new capability, especially in small business. The reason we're afraid of the cloud isn't really security, because we trust cloud providers to be as secure as we are. It's the ability to get at data. It's the exportability of data. It's the accessibility and management of data. So, I mean, my argument for the more aggressive cloud forecast, which is the one I believe, is that I think the key factor here is that as we move through that curve, we move away from an ITDM-focused cost takeout, make sure you cover off security market, and low-hanging fruit for Office 365 Salesforce, to a market where we start to see that because we've reduced the friction in the application of new technology almost to zero with cloud-based costing and charging mechanisms, that we can now apply cloud in many different areas. Then we start a little bit higher and we end up at about 60%, just over 60% of the software dollar being allocated to SaaS by the end of the decade. That's driven, as I say, I mean, what I think will drive the SaaS is important because it enables new functionality is this chart here that shows 37 different areas, and that's just my list. I mean, other people I'm sure could add areas to this. 37 different areas where you can use SaaS, actually SaaS sold by Canadian companies today, to automate IT operations, financial operations, HR talent management, business ops, customer service, marketing, and or sales, and different aspects of each of those areas. And the point that I made in that clock with the, what is the cloud debate? Today we talk a lot about technology because for the first 90 minutes or 2 hours of the 24 hours of cloud, technology is the most important issue that we have to understand. But for most of the time that we'll be talking about cloud, the most important issues to understand won't be how to deploy it or how to support it. It will be how management can take advantage of readily available SaaS-based technology to improve their operations in these kinds of areas. You'll notice that medium and large business in each category is substantially ahead of small business in terms of adoption, which isn't a surprise because they have more people and more ability to deploy technology like this. You'll notice that medium business is particularly focused in solving core IT issues like financial operations, like IT operations, where quite a lot of technology is already deployed today. Whereas small businesses, and this is consistent with some other survey research that we've done in the past, tend to use SaaS applications to address holes in their organizational, in their org charts. They tend to use technology instead of people to address requirements that they have in their business that they can't afford to staff and ramp up themselves. And if we look at purchase intentions, we see that in all of these categories, both small and medium business is keenly interested in using SaaS to help improve the overall quality of their delivery of these different business services to their staff, to their shareholders, to their customers and suppliers, and or to reduce the cost and friction of these business processes within their overall operations.